We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to Sex in the Single Flower. Let me just start off by saying that this presentation is rated G. Tonight's presentation is entitled Sex and the Single Flower. The discussion will cover subjects like how to identify the sex of a plant, how many trees are needed for red oak to reproduce. We'll be talking about taking a look at both familiar and unfamiliar ways, including weird and interesting ways that plants propagate their species. The program will be about 50 minutes in length with 10 minutes at the end for questions. Please mute your speaker and take yourself off video to prevent any distractions. The chat box will be open for questions for Sherry. One of our co-hosts will collate that information and give the questions for Sherry to answer. If you have ideas to share with other participants, please save those for another format. At the end of the presentation, please complete the very short poll that you will find to the right of the chat box on the bottom of your screen. Our presenter tonight is Sherry Kern. Sherry's a member of the Virginia Beach Master Gardener class of 1998. She's a tree steward since 2000. She's a certified arborist. She was a horticulture instructor at Tidewater Community College for almost 20 years. And she is the co-author of a must-read book called Best Plants for Hampton Roads, a landscape and garden companion. She's a self-described tree hugger and tree lover. So Sherry, please go ahead and begin your presentation.
Thank you, Susan. Hello, everybody. This is truly an autumn day. I love autumn, my favorite season, and so it just feels good. Anyway, I'm here to talk about sex in the single flower. And I had several other master gardeners help me come up with that title. It was kind of interesting how we came up with it. But one of the things that propelled me to make this talk is that in talking to experienced master gardeners, to horticulture students, and to other people, there was some terminology used that a lot of them just didn't quite understand. And so I thought maybe I could help understanding with some of the terminology. And another thing that started it was the second slide that I have right here. Hold on, for some reason, it's not wanting to advance. Okay, there we go. Was this question a long time ago, and I'm sure several of you have had this. How can I tell the sex of my holly? Well, if you have it looking like this Yopon holly right here with all the red berries, the fact that it has fruit tells you it's female. That's a female holly. Well, here's kind of an idea of how the conversation went. And I said, by looking at the flowers and seeing what sexual parts are there. But it won't flower again until next year. That's months away. There's no other easy way. And this person kept insisting I tell them how to tell the sex of the flower. And they said, are you sure there's no other easy way? Said, so how do I know what I'm buying at the garden center if the holly isn't blooming? How do I know? And you know, that's a good question. How do you know? And you have to go by the tagging that's on the plant, and hopefully the tagging is accurate. And of course, at the garden center, the majority of them are selling it. They weren't necessarily the original growers. So it is totally dependent on the tagging by the original growers. So otherwise, you wait until you see the flower. So this isn't a botany class, but we'll do a little bit right here. This is parts of a complete flower, but we're just going to zero in on the male and female parts. And these parts right here that have the pollen, those are stamens. And when I was learning this long time ago, somebody said, well, the way you can always tell those are the male parts is because they stay men. It's like, oh, grown. Anyway, it works. I use that. And then the female part is here, and it is called, overall, it's called the pistil, and it rises the stigma. You're going to hear the word stigma, which is the part here that actually captures the pollen. And then the style is this, which too goes down to the ovary down here. So the stigma, the style, and the ovary, those make up the pistil. So with that in mind, let's look at more information about the Yopon holly. And why do people like Yopon hollies? These are pretty popular plants. And when you start looking, they make good screening, hedges. They're used specimen plants. Because look at this one on the left, on the right here, the pendula. That is a beautiful specimen plant. They make barriers and espaliers. There are numerous cultivars of this. So people like Yopon hollies. Grows about 15 to 20 feet tall. It comes down to what the cultivar is. So with that in mind, now we're going to go into the sex part, which it means looking at the flowers. Well, these flowers are I can't see them well enough to determine. So let's go to this. This is a female flower. And this part in the middle is that receptacle. It's the pistil part. And these are stamens, but they're non-functioning. They don't do anything. It's just for looks. It's like the plant hasn't caught on yet in the evolution or the breeding, that stamens aren't needed. So it still puts them there, but they're not necessary. And then the male flower, notice it has no pistil in there. Okay, there's no pistil, but it has stamens, and these stamens are loaded with pollen. So if you see pollen, you are looking at the male flower. That's the best way to tell. And if they have this plant in their landscape and they want to know, you tell them just wait until it flowers. That's the only way you can positively tell. Well, one thing I want to point out by this man named Dr. Tim Coder, he is a professor of tree biology and healthcare at the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources at University of University of Georgia. And I trust everything this man says. I have heard him speak. I have read many of his articles. And this one right here is called tree gender. And it's just a short, sweet approach to tree gender and the sexual reproduction strategies. And here's what he says about trees, because trees have gender issues. They really do. He says, you cannot tell flower function or gender just by looking. Well, when we can look and tell it, we consider ourselves fortunate. But apparently there are times where you get pistils that don't function, or you get, like this case, you have the stamens that don't function. All we as laymen can do is just trust the basics. And that's kind of what this is all about. So since hollies need both a male, they need a male and a female, then totally two different plants. Male flowers are on one plant, the female flowers are on the other plant. They are considered to be dioecious. To the aecious part essentially means house. These hollies require two houses, and the houses are the entire plant right there. Okay, so the male plant and then the female plant. It takes both of them. So hollies are dioecious. If we go to, let me check something. Okay, that's it. If we go now, we're moving on a little bit. Oh, one thing I want to say about the hollies right here is that some of them actually have what's called perfect flowers. A perfect one will show up. Well, what perfect means is that one flower has both the male and female parts in it. when that happens, that's the best scenario, if you will. So, okay, now we're going to shift gears a little bit, and I'm sure many of you all have seen this. Happens every spring. If you've got oak trees around, you're going to get these. One person I know looked at this slide and said, "Oh, that's the morning after." I thought that was kind of funny right there. So let's look at the first one, Quercus palustris, which is your pin oak. Pin oaks are just marvelous trees, and they are in the red oak group right here. So here's a pin oak, and here is a close-up of the leaves. See how the lobes are very deeply U-shaped, and then it has this little, look to it there. Anyway, these are this is just a lovely tree, and it has these acorns, which are the tree nuts, and they take 2 years to grow to be mature, and then they'll drop on the ground. So a Quercus palustris, a pin oak, is right here. It has both male flowers and female flowers. If you look at most of the literature written for everyday folks, they'll talk about the male flowers. They rarely ever will talk about the female flowers. So you have to dig more to get information on that. These male flowers, showy, these are the catkins. They're called catkins, and they hang. And then when they die and fall off, this is what you get. You get that mess. And yes, you need to pull out the leaf blower to get them all out of your way. So the male flowers are showy, conspicuous. You can see them easily. The female flowers are right here. They're in this picture and in this picture right here. And the females, they will grow in the new leaf axils. That's the areas where the stem comes off of the branch, if you will. So, and they tend to be more reddish looking. And if these don't get fertilized, they get jettisoned, they will fall off. And so sometimes you will see these red things on the ground under your oak tree, and you wonder, what are those? Those are just jettisoned female flowers that didn't get fertilized, so therefore they're not going to make acorns. What studies have shown is that the males mature 7 to 10 days before the female flowers, which is nice. That way then it's giving the females time to get set up, I guess. Anyway, the pin oak flowers, just more on them. See here, they're growing. You could see this is an extended growth beyond what the previous slide showed. And they're on this greenish reddish spur twig right there. So there you see the females. And then here are the showy male catkins. And like it says, they're hanging catkins from the leaf buds of the leaf axils of last year's growth, not from this year's growth. And then just above them, or further out on that stem, the new growth are the female flowers. And this second picture right here is just a close-up of that first picture. But there you go. Those are the female flowers. See, they're not showy at all. And then the male flowers are over here. They tend to start opening up. This is when they're young and very immature. You will start seeing them as the leaves are starting to unfold. See the baby leaves here starting to unfold. If you look over here in the middle picture, the leaves have already grown to pretty much mature size, or they're on their way to that size. So this is showing you what you're seeing, and it gives you an idea of what you would look at. So just to recap, these flowers are the female on the newer growth. These male catkins are on last year's growth. And if you go further back on the stem, which isn't in this picture, you will see developing baby acorns from last year's crop. So a pin oak is what you say is monoecious, because did you notice in those pictures, the male and female flowers are on the same plant. They're not coming, the parts are not coming out of one single flower. Okay, but they're separate flowers. They're on the same plant. So monoecious, the mono or mon means one, echious house. So look at it as one house holds both of these sexes. It's just they're not on the same flower. But, oaks, these woody plants, as Dr. Coder says, these woody plants don't quite have the idea of gender, fixing their gender straight. So they will actually develop some perfect flowers also, which means that one flower will have both sexes. So kind of interesting to look at. It makes you want to see next year's growth and start looking at the growth and what's going on. Okay, this picture is of a northern red oak, which is Quercus rubra, a northern red oak. And northern red oaks are a type of red oak, which means they require 2 seasons of growth for an acorn to mature. So this northern red oak is also monoecious, so you will see both male and female flowers on the same stem or the same tree. And so if we start from the newer growth out, here are the current year's female flowers right there. Then here, growing in the axils of last year's growth, you were seeing the male catkins. And then back here, see how you see the little tiny baby year-old acorns from last year's growth. So red oaks take 2 years for their acorns to mature. So when you see red oak acorns on your sidewalk or whatever, it took 2 years for them to get that size and drop off. Sometimes people will look at acorn drop and say it predicts the winter. No, because sometimes you might be looking at 2 years growth of acorns. So now, Quercus phellos is also another type of red oak. And another way to tell red oaks is just looking at the leaves. The leaves will have a bristle on tips. So if you look at this leaf, this pin oak leaf right there, and it has a little bristle at the tip. Some of these right there, I'm seeing it in this picture here. See that bristle? That's an indicator of a red oak. So willow oaks, red oaks, and willow oaks take 2 years for their acorns to mature also. They're in that red oak group. Willow oaks, sometimes I have heard willow oaks called pin oaks because they look like a writing pen. That has nothing to do with naming these plants. A willow oak is called that because its leaves look like leaves on a willow, like a weeping willow, if you will. They look more like that. Michael Durr says that the willow oak is the best oak for overall texture and form. And the landscape industry has discovered the willow oak. And if anything, they're now being overplanted. But they are beautiful trees. Yes, you will get acorn crops. You will get those. And I know some people don't like oak trees because of the acorns, but they're such magnificent trees. Anyway, moving on. Let's go a little bit more talking about the sex of them. When you look at these branches here, man, not only do you see the leaves readily, but you see all of the catkins, the male flowers. And you would need binoculars from the ground if you're looking up, or else pull a branch down to your eye level to see the female flowers. See the female flowers here. You're seeing the female. And if you look right there, here are female flowers, okay? Not showy at all. People don't even notice this, but sometimes you might see a reddish sheen on an oak tree. And if you do that and it's not the leaves, it could be the female flowers that you're seeing. So that's talking about your woody oaks. And so now let's talk about a conifer, the Severus Di Diodera. The cedar is also monoecious. Well, remember what monoecious means. Mono, one, house. It has both male flowers and female flowers on the same plant. Okay. And you're going, flowers? I've never seen flowers. Well, gymnosperms, of which this cedar is one, gymnosperms don't have flowers as we think of with the angiosperms, which are flowering plants. That's what I've been talking about on prior slides. They belong to angiosperms, flowers. Well, here, we'll talk about flowers in the next slide, but just looking at them, if you look at right here around one little growth node, right there, for instance, around that one, and you were to count the bristles, you could count like 15 to 20 of those needle-like leaves that are in a whorl, WHORL, in a whorl around that stem at that place. These are beautiful trees when they're planted in the right spot where they're given the space to grow. I associate them with cemeteries, just because that's where I have seen the majority of them in my life. There's a beautiful one on the grounds of the Virginia Tech Research Center on Diamond Springs Road in Virginia Beach. But you could see as a mature specimen, they are beautiful. And there's a lot of cultivars of this cedrus. Well, now let's get to talking about their fruit or their flowers. If you look at the picture on the left, this is the female cone. This one is more noticeable, and it's even oozing some stickiness, which will help capture male pollen. Just because they're non-flowering plants doesn't mean that they don't have other structures to hold the male and female parts, and the males still produce pollen. These over here, which are more insignificant looking, these are the male pollen cones that you see, and they tend to shed pollen. Well, a lot of pines will shed their pollen, or cedars will shed their pollen in the fall. This one, now you're looking at mature cones. This is the female mature cone, and she's only about 2 inches tall. And this one obviously has fallen off onto the ground, but she gives you this brown rose looking thing. And you could see why it's so valuable for arrangements or anything. Spray paint those gold, silver, sprinkle glitter. You can make all kinds of arrangements with them. And then this down here, these are the male cones right here. These are reaching maturity. Okay, these are pretty mature. And then once they have expelled their pollen, these cones drop to the ground, and you get these funny looking structures that look like, what are those worms called? Oh gosh. Anyway, they look like the fuzzy woolly worms that you'll see crawling along. And then you pick them up and you realize they're not alive at all. Okay, so these are the male flower parts that have been jettisoned. There's no need for them anymore. Meanwhile, here's the female, and gymnosperms have what's called naked seed, which means the seed that they will have that comes from this female, those seed are not enclosed in an ovary. So a little bit more about conifer reproduction, and in a lot of observations and studies, the female cones typically grow in the upper branches, and you'll see the number of them dwindling as you go down the tree. And then the male cones tend to grow towards the bottom of the tree. And there's two theories about that. And by the males being down here, they're less likely to pollinate its own females on that tree, less likely to pollinate, so that the pollen would get blown away. And another one is that by the females being up here, remember the females are going to have next year's growth, the next generation. You want to protect those. So by the females being higher up in the tree, they're being protected from grazing animals, from predators, scavengers, anything that's going to feed on them. And I was starting to think, okay, as these trees grow, they tend to lose some of these bottom branches. Maybe not all, obviously, but I was thinking, well, then what would graze on them? The woolly mammoth. That could be one. The woolly mammoth could have grazed on them. And this would just put the female cones maybe out of their reach. Okay, so another conifer, Pinus taida, which is loblolly pine. Around here, we have a lot of loblolly pines. They grow naturally. And when I moved here back in 1979, I wasn't familiar with loblolly at all. And it seemed like every pine tree was a loblolly tree. So unfortunately, I made the conclusion that every pine tree around here was a loblolly. That is so not true. There are lots of other pines out there, but the loblolly is one of the major ones. And in this is just showing are these pines male or female? And if you're thinking female, you are correct. These are very mature female cones, and the seeds have probably dropped out already or will be. But the needles tend to be in bundles of 3. So if you go back to its little fastener, which is called the fascicle, and that holds the bundle together, typically there are 3 needles to a bundle. And you could see how big they grow. They're adaptable trees. They're not really recommended that much as landscape trees, though, for your own landscape. Okay, just now looking in at the sexual parts. You look at these like worm-like structures there, and it's like, oh gosh, what are those? Well, those are the male flowers. You're looking at the male flowers. And when you start seeing these, they are pretty obvious. And people do make mistakes of thinking those are going to be the pine cones. Well, if you go to this picture here at the bottom, these are the little male cones. These are the male cones. And then here is what's called a candle growing in between them. And that candle is vegetative growth. That's going to send out new needles and growth like that. And then over here, these are just tiny little baby females. These are little baby female cones. So when they first start developing, they're these little purplish things that people don't even think, they think they're buds. So they don't take them seriously at all and tend to disregard them. This picture was primarily to show you the seeds, and you get an idea of what they look like. Most of you all, I'm sure, have seen the seeds already. Okay, so we're shifting gears. And okay, one question though, just again, if you go back to the loblolly pine, is the loblolly pine monoecious or dioecious? And it is monoecious because you have both the male and the female on the same tree. Okay, so now look at this is the Ginkgo Biloba. Oops, didn't mean to go that far. This is Ginkgo Biloba. I'm sure many of you all familiar with this. This is also that big, beautiful, mature tree in the front lawn of the research center, again on Diamond Springs Road. This was taken a few falls ago, autumn, and you could see all of the fallen leaves. It just gives such a beautiful look. And you could see how the branches grow almost at a horizontal connection to the trunk. Just a very strong, sturdy tree. Well, the interesting part about this is it is considered a fossil tree. This is one of those that grew during the Triassic period. And as a matter of fact, ginkgos are called the oldest living seed plant. These are considered gymnosperms because they have cones, which means they have naked seed. And if you're saying, cone, I've never seen a ginkgo cone, you probably have, just didn't realize that's what they were called. And ironically, if you do get a ginkgo, generally they have to be 20 years or more older before they even start flowering. So before you even start getting production of the next generation. So looking at it a little closer, this is the female to the right that you see here, and it's growing in the axil. And generally, these sticky droplets right here, they capture the pollen grains. They're typically in groups of 2, sometimes 3, sometimes 1, like that. But these capture the pollen, and the pollen that's been blown by the wind. And so in this case, though, the males bloom first. Now let's go to this. The male is below, and it's on a separate tree. And if you look at this, every one of these is an individual little male cone, if you will. Each tiny little ball is a male cone. So, and it's where you're going to get the pollen. People never notice these because they're so little. You have to actually be looking for them to see them. And typically the males will bloom first, or excuse me, the females will bloom first, and then 4 months later, then the pollen gets produced, which means then these females have lots of time to capture pollen. So the Gingko fruit, right here, you see 2 of them in this picture. And if you're looking at, these are fruit, these are actual cones. And these are fruit, but typically one of these will jettison and to leave room for the other one to mature. And I understand these are edible, but those of you who are familiar with the female, with this fruit off of a ginkgo tree, you know, somebody has to have some pretty strong nostrils or being able to ignore scent, because it's very malodorous. As a matter of fact, you start looking at your shoes, wondering where the dog was, and you could have sworn you didn't step on anything. So very stinky. That's why it's recommended a lot of times to plant a male tree and not the female tree. Well, the female's okay as long as you can ensure there's no males anywhere nearby. Now, I don't know how close nearby is. 5 miles? I don't know. But anyway, this is the seed right here. And this is just a fleshy coating that was on it. And you could see how it turns brown, dries up, breaks off, and or else people eat it. So, but the fruit is actually a naked seed because it does not have, it wasn't enclosed in an ovary. This covering is not the ovary. Ironically, they have found that ginkgos can change sex from male to female whenever it's needed. And in times of climate change, I think we're going to see more instances of this in our woody plants and maybe in even our herbaceous plants. I don't know. So, but ginkgos have been known to change their sex. So now let's talk about something that you might be a little more familiar with, and that's squash. We see lots of winter squash around right now. People love their squash, and I'm sure many of you are making many delicious meals out of them or nice decorations. But is this right here, and these up here that have been sliced to let you see what they look like, are these fruits or veggies, botanical wise? The question you want to answer is, what was on that plant in the same spot where you found these growing? And what was there was a flower. So if there was a flower there first, then it is called a fruit. Okay, fruits come from flowers. So the winter squash, we call them vegetables as far as our kitchen goes and then the grocery store, but botanically they're actually fruit. Okay, so let's go back to monoecious. And you know, this is a favorite, the pumpkin squash. These are favorite plants of people. And right here you see the female flower. And these flowers are on, see now it's called monoecious. Mono one,ecious house. So you get both female, male flowers on the same plant. So here's the female, and what looks like just a bunch of bundles right there, all together, they actually make up the pistil part of it. And then, well, if you look over here in this big picture in a female pumpkin, those parts are actually coming out. And then you have the opening right there. And that opening is the where the style will grow down to the ovary. Well, then on a female flower, you will see this fleshy receptacle there. It's an immature fruit. You'll get that, and you'll see the dead flower here. Well, if that flower falls off and this fruit never develops any bigger, this is a common question at help desk and at Ask a Master Gardener booths, is why didn't it develop the fruit? What happened to it? And it's just this part. That flower never got fertilized. You need fertilization, pollination to take place before your fruit will mature. Okay, here is a male flower. And if you look down in here, the male flower has nothing of the female parts, but it has that stamen, which has the pollen on it. And right here, these stamens have all just enclosed up. Okay, they're on long, narrow stems, and they have just enclosed around. One author likened this to, and I just had to laugh out loud. He said this cluster of anthers, which is where the pollen is, reminds him of what his wife uses on her eyelashes. And I had to think for a minute, oh, he's referring to her mascara brush. Anyway, I think he's kind of stretching it, but oh well, if it helps you remember, so be it. So, pollinating squash, when pollinators can't or don't do the pollination tango. For some reason, your bees didn't get out there, maybe they weren't around, and you just didn't get any bees to pollinate your squash. So then you step in, and there are so many different ways to do this. And this one, they said, actually take a male flower, strip off all of the petals around it, so you're totally exposing that anther, and then reach in with that anther, into the female flowers, and you can fertilize them. Or you can use a brush and go in and gently brush the anther, and then go in and brush the pistils. And you can do it that way. Some people use Q-tips. I mean, there are lots of good different ways. So isn't this interesting? Knowing this about the sexes of the flowers, we then can manipulate it to serve our own purposes. In this case, we want to ensure that we get fruit. We want the fruit. So what happens when you cross a zucchini with a pumpkin? Well, what does cross mean? And it means that the sexes, like a male zucchini pollen will fertilize a female pumpkin, okay, or vice versa. And so when you cross those, you are going to get a pumpkini. So, and I understand that these aren't real tasty, a little bitter even. If you want to ensure that you don't get strange hybridizations like this, then keep your various cucurbit crops separated in your garden. Cucurbits are notorious, very promiscuous for readily hybridizing with each other. And seed breeders, if they sell hybrids, they have to ensure that they maintain a population of both of those mother and father plants to cross them every year to get a specific hybrid variety. And that means there can't be any other cucurbits nearby that could get in and mess it all up. So you can't have that. So here's another interesting thing, pan-fried zucchini flowers. You can go online and get the the recipe for this, and you can use both male and female flowers. And you do this with ricotta and fresh herbs, and yum, yum, yum. Those look good enough to eat. However, if you are wanting the crop of zucchini in your garden, then ensure that you don't use the female flowers, okay? Because that's where your fruit will grow. These things that we do. Okay, tomatoes. Everybody loves tomatoes, and it's one of the first vegetable plants people will start with when they're starting a vegetable garden. They'll grow tomatoes, obviously other plants too, but think of a tomato flower. Is the male flower on one plant and the female on another? Do you have separate male and female flowers on the same plant? Or does one flower on the plant have both male and female parts? Okay, so think about it. Anyway, so next picture should help you figure it out. A tomato flower is neither monoecious nor dioecious. The sexes are not separated. They're in the same flower. You know what I think of when I look at monoecious and dioecious? Well, I'm thinking of like college dorms, if you will. So I look at this one where you have both sexes in the same flower. This is when you get the co-ed dorms, I guess, or co-ed rooms, if you look at that. Both of those. So anyway, looking at this picture right here, this in the middle, okay, there is the stigma, which is receptive to the pollen. Then here's the long style, goes down to the ovary, which is where your tomato will grow. And then these out here are the stamens where you get the pollen. So since they're both in the same flower, it has its own special name. Next slide, we'll talk about that. Okay, these are just more pictures, and this shows here, see the stigma is totally enclosed by the stamen, but the stigma is sticking out. Okay, over here, if you will, you could see that the stigma, you can't see the stigma. It's totally enclosed inside the surrounding stamen. So, question about would it pollinate itself or not? Well, these plants, tomato flowers are perfect. I talked about this earlier, and perfect flowers are flowers where you have both sexes within one flower. Now you're looking at just one part of that plant. You don't have to look at a whole plant or a whole plant. You don't have to do that. Okay, so some synonyms that you will see for the word perfect flowers, they could be self-pollinating. They might be hermaphrodites. I don't think I say that right. Selfing, self-fertilization. Those, you will hear those terms a lot of times when you're talking about perfect flowers. Okay, this is just some examples of perfect flowers in your vegetable garden. And the column on the left are your self-pollinating ones. The column on the right are your cross-pollinating, which means then beets, for instance, need to pollinate adjacent beet plants, okay, and not right there, its own flower, if you will. So, and then some of these plants do both. They self-pollinate and cross-pollinate. Kind of interesting when you think of this. Incidentally, on the website is a PDF version of my PowerPoint, and you could go in there and print this particular slide if you would like. Okay, let's talk about Easter lilies a minute. This is an example of another perfect flower. These are very obvious. Remember, perfect is only referring to the sexes. And in here, you definitely can see this part in the middle. That is the pistil. Here is the stigma, which is sticky, and it actually will drip stickiness. And that stickiness will capture pollen. And then it has the long, and then right here, it has the long style, and then it goes to the ovary down. right here. This one, these are the stamens with the pollen that has been brushed, gravity makes it fall or whatever. Brushing against it can make it fall. Incidentally, do Easter lilies naturally bloom at Easter time? And around here, no, they do not. They have to be forced, and they take a lot of work. It's a lot of work to force them to bloom at Easter. And Easter bounces around all the time. So the people who grow these lilies have to know exactly how to figure when Easter is and consult a good calendar. But essentially, Easter is the first Sunday following the first full moon of the vernal equinox. So, or go backwards. When is the vernal equinox for that year? Then, when is the first full moon during that vernal equinox? And then, when's the first Sunday after that? And that's when Easter is. So let's talk about Easter lily emasculation. And that means exactly what it says. It means that you're going to remove the anthers, the stamens, the male parts. You're literally going to remove them. And there's a question as to why would you want to remove them? Well, there are different theories, different schools of thought about this. And one of them is, well, let me back up. See how messy this pollen is when it falls? And it's not a very pretty picture if you're using this as a tabletop flower. Okay, so, and also this pollen can stain your tablecloth, it can stain your carpet, it can stain your clothing. So what you want to do maybe is remove it. So by removing these, just before they've opened up, and you can reach in and gently tug on these stamens and they'll pull right out. And you won't get any pollen on you or anything. Pull right out, throw them away. So, and then another school of thought for why you want to do this is that it will keep the plants in flowering stage longer. It will preserve the health of the flowering plant itself, of that flower longer. Now, other people disagree with that. And I am not making the decision. All I know is for myself, I remove them because I don't want to deal with the mess. So after it's all done, that's what you're left with. You're left with this real pretty flower. You still have the smell. You still have a lot of things going on with this. Okay, so now let's talk about another perfect flower, sunflowers. We all love our sunflowers. And I took this picture at a sunflower farm back in August. It's just lovely, just not finished. But exactly where are the stamens and the pistils? And apparently, a lot of people who work with children use sunflowers as hands-on activities, and the kids pull these apart and they identify the pieces of the flower. So if I go to this picture, we're starting to work that way. Well, before we go any further, do you see the 3 pollinators on that flower? Most people see the monarch butterfly right away and the bumblebee. But then when you look, okay, focus right there. There's a honeybee in there too. So they're all enjoying this flower completely. So if you look, this is what's called a disc floret. That's what all of these are that are growing in the center. And right here, these are immatures. They haven't grown big enough yet. So, but these right here are disc florets. These big showy parts that are so pretty, those are the ray florets. And the ray florets typically do not have an ovary attached, but some do. There's no one set rule for all of these plants. And the main role for the ray florets is to attract the pollinators. And when the pollinators get there, they, wow, look at this dinner there, dinner time. So the parts of a sunflower, when you look at this is a cross section of it, and you could see right here, see, there you go. This is the disc floret right here. And down here is the ovary. And that's where you're going to get your sunflower seeds if these have been fertilized. And notice I'm trying not to go deep into the biology or botany of these, just enough to help you determine what's going on with these. Now, this particular cross section shows that the ray florets have ovaries, and they may. It just depends on the plant. So many cultivars going on, and but a lot of what happens is that the stamens fuse and grow around the style, and the style is what's poking its head up right there, and you get the stigma up there, which is what accepts the pollen. So it's just really interesting. There you go. See, these stamens here have fused, if you will, kind of around the stigma there and the style. Okay, blackberry fruit. This is an aggregate fruit. Each of these tiny little things right there came from it. Those are individual fruits. So when you call this whole thing a fruit, it's actually aggregate, means it's a group of a bunch of little fruits, just a group of a bunch of little ones. And so when you look at these, each one of these came from a separate ovary. So when you think about blackberries, you're looking at the flowers that numerous stamens and pistils, and you get numerous ovaries from a single flower. So if we look at this, okay, we're going to look at another picture up closer. But do you see these dried out shriveled parts right there? Those are shriveled styles and shriveled styles, especially these in the fruit itself are shriveled styles. There's advantages and disadvantages to the way that they produce fruit. These bypass fertilization completely. They don't require pollination at all. Now, if you want to know what's going on with your blackberries, refer to the tag, the label that came with it to tell you what's happening. Rarely ever are they going to use this word, apomixis. They might just say that it develops seeds asexually, which means no sex was involved. You did not need fertilization to do it. So this is pretty interesting. It is a very good species preservation tool as far as that goes. The only thing is that all of the fruit are clones of the fruit of the plant from which it came. Advantages to this about developing asexually like this is that it can lead to many other species. You could still get fruit. You don't have to worry about pollinators, and you don't have to worry about excess energy of the plant being expended on pollen production. It could all now go into fruit production. Some disadvantages of this asexual propagation: you might get diminished fertility, and sometimes they don't adapt well to a changing environment, which might be detrimental or problematic with climate change. Okay, but the thing about apomixis is asexual reproduction, and you still get seeds, okay? You still get seeds. Those seeds are asexual though, okay? Moving on. So let me back up just a minute to this one. Right there is, it looks like just a single female part, but there are actually numerous female parts there, and each of them have their own ovary. What you're seeing here are all these different little stamens as far as that goes. So apomixis, it prevents loss of specific characteristics in a hybrid. And they're finding that this is actually more common than originally thought, but scientists don't fully understand this. They go into a lot of explanation of, you know, the different gametes and stuff like that, way over my head. All we want to know is if we're dealing with this, what to expect. Well, they found that this is very common in citrus, very common. You get the seeds, but a lot of those fruit have come from asexual reproduction. Your hawthorns, which is this, shadbush or serviceberry, a lot of them have, they practice apomixis propagation. They practice that. Okay, in the Asteraceae family, the Centaurea, which is right here, that one is an example of it. In the middle bottom is a grass, Calamagrostis, and this one practices apomixis, and the one on the right, of course, is the rose family, the rubris. So it's more common than thought, and there's still so much that's not known about this. But the key to remember about apomixis, asexual, and you get seeds. So if you think about eating blackberry fruit, you still get the seeds in your teeth. So now let's shift gears, talk about your common fig, just your common fig. Have you ever actually seen a fig flower? And some of you may have. Where this comes from, was there actually a flower there before you got this? And the answer is no, not if it was a brown turkey or many other cultivars. There was no flower there. This is not a fruit. This is actually just an enlarged, excuse me just a minute. It's like an enlarged or modified stem. It's just a modified stem and a fleshy hollow receptacle to hold all the stuff that's going on. Well, my granddaughter gets interested in some of this stuff. And so we picked a brown turkey fig and she sliced it open. And what you're seeing here, see those, all of those things in there, all of those are flowers. Those are the flowers. So if you've ever cut an immature fruit open or an immature fig open, you have seen their flowers and probably didn't realize that's what they were. They're all flowers, but they don't need pollination. That means, so if they don't need pollination, that means pollination from a male. They don't need that, okay? So therefore, since you don't get pollination, you do get fruits all inside here, but the fruits have no seeds. These are seedless. And if you're going, but, when I bite into one of these, I get a crunch. Do you hear that crunch when you bite into one? Well, that crunch are seed coats that developed to be ready to around a seed that never formed. So it's like the plant hasn't quite caught up with the breeding practices. Oh, it doesn't need a seed coat after all. So anyway, these are the flowers and there is no pollination, but you still get fruit, but no seeds. And the fruit are all the little ones inside. So this is parthenocarpy. It's asexual, but no seeds. Do you see the difference between parthenocarpy and apomixis? Parthenocarpy, no seeds. Apomixis, you still get seeds, but they're both asexual means of propagation. So just look at that, yum, yum, yum. And here, my granddaughter was, she broke off just a part there inside, and so that you could see up close what's going on there. And what you're seeing are the elongated styles of various of the flowers, if you will. And here just looks good. Yum, yum, yum. This is the brown turkey. And there are lots of parthenocarpic fig cultivars. You could look at all of those and see what's going on. there are approximately 250 species of figs out there, and a lot of them practice parthenocarpy, and a lot of them require pollination. But the one that I'm going to talk about, this is called the calamiras. Calamiras are the only fig trees requiring pollination, as far as we're concerned in our eating, in what we eat. And these are primarily used for dried figs and confectionaries like fig Newtons, pastries, things like that. So here's a ripened receptacle loaded, just loaded with the fruit. Now, these are fruits, excuse me, that actually have seeds. They actually have seeds. There were so many of them in there that the receptacle couldn't hold them and it burst open from it in that picture. So now let's look over here. See each of these? Each of these are elongated styles, if you will. And this opening right there, okay, it has a lot of scales, scale-like coverings. But since these require pollination and the flowers are inside that big growth, then how does it get pollinated? And these are by tiny little wasps. And what they've done is they've already dabbled in pollen somewhere, and they have to crawl in that opening, and they get in here. And the female wasps that are pregnant, they actually will lay their eggs, and the eggs will go down into the ovaries also. And but anyway, then they proceed to pollinate because they had pollen on their little legs. Their body parts will break off as they're coming in, like antennae and wings, and a lot of times she can't get back out. So yes, she will die in there, and then, but she has meanwhile laid all these babies, but these babies never get to grow up in this case because this fruit or these figs are harvested for production. So flowers with long stalks. And if you're going, that means, are we eating tiny wasp parts? Yeah. Yes, you are. Okay, so now let's talk about the Nellie R. Stevens Ilex holly. And this one is a hybrid between the Ilex aquifolium, which is the English holly, and the Ilex cornuta, which is the Chinese holly. But now remember earlier when we looked at the Yaupon holly, we saw, okay, you need male and female plants. So Ilexes are dioecious, but this one is special in that it will develop fruits a lot of times without fertilization from a male pollinator. It will practice parthenocarpy. So you can't tell by looking, can you, that it practiced parthenocarpy? So how could you positively identify that? And you would have to then cut open a fruit. And if you have seeds, then it was the dioecious part. But if you have no seeds, if you have seedless fruit, then it practiced parthenocarpy, didn't have pollination. So this is a good one. Nellie R. Stevens is a tree that is highly recommended. A lot of people plant it. It's one of the best. Michael Durr says one of the best for southern states. And it is relatively fast growing. The Nellie R. Stevens was first out there in 1954. And but if you want a male to pollinate, then Edward J. Stevens is the male one. It's useful for pollinating Nellie if you want that. So it's pretty interesting in that regard. So if people want a holly, they don't want to have to get a male, tell them to get a Nellie R. Stevens. And then that practices parthenocarpy. What kind of sex does it practice? Well, we, as people who like to eat, we benefit from parthenocarpic fruits without seeds, seedless bananas, figs, pineapples, grapes, oranges. A lot of those will actually grow parthenocarpy naturally. Or we humans can induce that by using hormones to simulate parthenocarpy. So we will force that. And of course, then it's just another way of how we manipulate the sexual parts of flowers of plants. Okay, got to talk about the viola for a minute. And the violas, these are plants that I love to hate. They're beautiful when they're blooming. Otherwise, they're a horrible invasive species. I just despise them. They have flowers both in the spring and the fall, but the fall buds tend not to open as much. And this one I hate because it spreads like crazy. It's difficult, very difficult to get rid of. It's a perennial, a creeping perennial. So anyway, though, violets are special, not because you can eat those flowers, but because they have underground flowers, which are called clistogamous flowers, which do not open, kind of underground or down near the very base. But they'll be right there at the ground surface. So the normal ones open up and they develop a regular fruit capsule, as I'm trying to show here, the picture on the left. And then down here, they're showing you, this is the clistogamous flower. Clistogamous flowers do not open up. Okay, all you will ever see is this, and they tend to, they make you think that you're looking at a flower bud, and you're not. You're looking at the entire flower. Male and female parts are both enclosed in that flower. So these are perfect flowers. And so what we say, see, you're seeing a whole bunch of them right here. What we say is that these self-pollinate. These particular flowers will self-pollinate, and then once they mature, they will eject the seeds mechanically, just like the open ones do at the top. Okay, they will eject the seeds. I had to look up clistogamous, and clistogamous is Greek for hidden husband. And I guess that references the fact that the stamens are hidden inside the flower along with the pistils. These are just close-ups of them so you could see them. They look kind of weird. And if you pull one up, go, these are really weird. You're looking at these clistogamous flowers. You could see how they've been in the ground, just a close-up of them. They never open any more than what you're seeing right there. However, you will get seeds. Okay, you'll still get seeds. The fruits develop underground. This is one that has developed above ground, you know, it from a regular flower. And you could see these seeds when this capsule opens up, these little tiny brown balls, and they eject out. Well, here, if you, and I was reading from someone, and she said, if you have the heart to cut open one of these flowers, you can actually see these little fruit, these little tiny miniature little fruits right there. And as a matter of fact, it says that there's a myth out there that fairies gather up these little iridescent seeds and string them into necklaces. That's what we do with a lot of things. We string them into necklaces, and they release these seeds directly into the soil or right there at the ground surface. So if you have any of these structures, any violets in your landscape, just go out there and pull the soil away from the base of the plant. Now's a good time to do it, and see if you could see any of those white or green reproductive structures. And it's not the only one that has clistogamous flowers. This is Oxalis or wood sorrel. This is just a close-up of a weedy wood sorrel so you could see what they look like. See how they have the heart-shaped leaflets. But this is a clistogamous flower. It will not open beyond that, but it will eject its seed. Okay, henbit.
Sherry,
Yes,
don't forget, we still need time for questions.
I know. I'm on my next to the last slide.
Okay.
Pretty close. Okay, this one, see these little flowers? These don't open up. Those are clistogamous, but they're above ground. Virginia buttonweed, a lot of you all have this. This has underground flowers, the clistogamous, and it's on my bucket list to find one day. And this one, here are the above ground flowers, above ground fruit. And the flowers underground don't look like that at all. They stay closed up, they self-pollinate, and they eject their seeds into the ground most likely. So I guess you just have to dig. Gives you another idea of why this weed is so difficult to control. And then one last thing, can plants get an STD, sexually transmitted disease? And that answer is yes. And it is called the anther smut, the dreaded venereal disease of the plant world. And what it does, if you look in this picture to the right, see how the anthers have blackened, shriveled up, and die. Here, the picture, you see healthy anthers on the flower to the left, and these smutted anthers to the right. And apparently it's spread by unsanitary and promiscuous insect pollinators. So, didn't know these pollinators could do that. So plants with asexual lifestyles don't have this problem, and which gives you a plus for cloning, apomixis, parthenocarpy, those types of things. So anyway, that went a little longer than I anticipated. I get really into this. So I am happy to answer questions if you're willing to go with me. Okay. Candy?
Yeah, Sherry, how do figs maintain genetic diversity if they do not produce seeds?
How do what?
How do figs
Maintain diversity?
genetic diversity if they do not produce seeds?
Okay, well, you don't get diversity in those breeds, like the brown turkey. Every one of those are clones of the parent plant. So there is no diversity. The diversity are in the other species that have to be pollinated by a tiny wasp.
So where does the pollen come from with a Calmarista fig?
Okay, what I can understand, because I am not a botanist, is what I can understand is that they have gotten pollinated in another one and were able to get out maybe, or I don't know. You've just asked a good question. I need to put that on my list. Where does the pollen come from? Thank you for that. Okay, next.
This one's a clarification. It is only the seed of the pumpkin zucchini cross that will produce a pumpkinini. All squash can be pollinated with other squash pollen to produce true fruit, but the seeds will produce the cross.
That's correct. That's correct, because you get these hybrids, and hybrids do not breed true to that plant that you started with the hybrid. They breed back to one of the parent plants. That is the problem with the hybridization.
Since violets are native, they aren't invasive, but they certainly are aggressive. Speaking of violets, they are the host plants for the Fritilia butterflies.
That's good to know. That's very good to know. I don't like the plant personally, and I have others in my yard, not the same species, and it's so aggressive that I have to use strong chemicals on it. I have no other way. There's no way I could dig it out. Roundup doesn't touch it.
And that's all of our questions.
Yeah.
Oh, wait a minute. Got another one. Tell us the name of the professor at the University of Georgia again, and remind us of his tree gender article.
Okay. The professor is Dr. Kim Coder, Coder, and it's a man, by the way. Sometimes you can't tell by names, but he's a gentleman, very knowledgeable, and he's with the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources out of the University of Georgia. If you just Google his name, Dr. Kim Coder, Oh my gosh, he's got buku articles out there and everything. But this one article was published back in March 2015, and it's called Tree Gender Sexual Reproduction Strategies. And it's part of the tree selection series, which is in their extension part.
What type of tree did you mention the Ginkgo Biloba was historically?
It is a fossil tree, Fossil, meaning that it shows up in fossils and everything. It's that old. It is from, what did I say, the Triassic period? Okay, I have to go back and double check that. Yes, the Triassic period. So the oldest living seed plant.
And
It's
then
been through a lot over the years and it's still standing. Nature is wonderful. Okay, go ahead.
I was just saying, do blackberries self-pollinate? You said they do not need pollinators, but why would they have stamen and pistils if they don't need them to form fruit?
Okay, in the readings that I've done about blackberries are kind of confused about gender. So there are blackberries out there that do practice fertilization, pollination, and fertilization. Okay, and then there are others that have this ability to develop the seeds asexually. And this could be induced by us humans. That way, then we get a better idea of exactly what we're going to produce if we're wanting to produce fruit for harvest.
Can blackberry plants be grown from seed, or are they sterile?
Well, if they're asexual, yes, I think you could still grow them from seed. It's just you will get what the mother plant was. Remember, there's no hybridization here. I understand that it's still a viable seed. I do need to double check that.
And that's all of our questions. Thank
All
you, Sherry.
Sherry, your presentation was excellent. Don't forget, please, to look at do the poll that's on your screen, or if it's not there, it's at right to the right of the chat box. If you enjoyed tonight's presentation, please tell a friend and join us for the 2022 Garden Talks and Workshop series that begins February 2022. Check the Virginia Beach Master Gardener website for a list of topics and speakers. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us tonight. Sure, you were awesome as usual.
Good night, everyone.